I'll be moderating today's talk, When COVID Cut Our Wings, and it's centered around the topic of mobility, and more specifically, aviation in the context of coronavirus. And I'll briefly run through and set the scene for the talk a little bit today before we move on to the next steps. The broader purpose of Transitions talks is to place the research efforts of scholars engaged in sustainability transitions in a broader context by inviting new perspectives around the topics of innovation and sustainability. And we do this by inviting different actors in a speaker and panel style format, often with a thematic focus in mind. Over the last few months, we've been becoming interested in the topic of mobility and more specifically flying. And of course, there's uncertainty surrounding both the social and technical implications of coronavirus for the practice of flying, as well as how the sector of aviation may respond to the macroeconomic challenges faced in the short term. The timing of this talk is therefore no coincidence, and we felt it would be a good opportunity to begin a conversation around some of the developments that we're seeing by including different organizations committed to reducing the climate implications and impacts of flying. And so today with me, we have co-organizers Shell and Maria, both of whom are PhD students at Chalmers University of Technology also, but in different divisions. And we're really pleased and really excited to be joined by our speaker today, Maya Rosen, who's climate activist and co-founder of the organization Stay on the Ground. Great to have you with us, Maya.
Thank you so much.
We're also excited to have researcher Stefan Gössling, professor at the Department of Service Management and Service Studies, Lund University, and the School of Business and Economics at Linnaeus University, and Jörgen Larsson, associate professor at the Department of Space, Earth and Environment. I just want to mention quickly that this is the second of at least 3 transition talks this year that we have scheduled for 2020. In April, Swedish author Jesper Weitz talked about the relationships between narratives or stories in engaging with climate change. And in September, we're pleased to be having Sanna Vanna, the presentation of Sami Nuoro, the Association for Sami Youth in Sweden. And Sanna will be sharing a perspective that centers around climate justice and the topic of transitions, with a focus on the struggles and conflicts that are faced by the Sami population in a Swedish perspective. So we're very excited for that. And as I've mentioned, today will be a panel style webinar. We have around 20 minutes for Maya in a few moments, who will have a keynote presentation. And then following that, we'll have about 15 minutes for Stefan and Jörgen to both relate to the conversation that Maya has started in this talk, and also through the work that she's been doing, and also to connect to the research that they've been doing on their side. And then after that point, we have 20 minutes where we'll open the floor for you, the audience, to be engaged. And you can do this by asking comments or questions, reacting to the work of everyone who is here today, and also providing just general insights into the conversations that we want to have today. And quickly, I just want to run through some technical and general guidelines before handing over to Maya. So I would ask that when you're not speaking and when you're not presenting, I would ask that you mute yourself. And if you'd like to ask a question, we would ask that you use the chat function in the bottom of the Zoom window. You can see a chat. You can pose comments, ask questions. These questions can be more general, or they can be directed to anyone who is presenting today. We will then offer the opportunity for you to introduce yourself and to ask your question more personally in the last 20 minutes of today's talk. For speakers, moderators, and panelists, we would ask that you have your video on so that we can see you. And today's presentation, as you heard at the beginning, it's recorded for viewing purposes to allow a broader audience to engage if they're not able to be here today. So with that said, I'd like to hand over to Maya. Welcome, thanks for being with us. You have around 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. For people to stop flying has been my greatest wish for many years, and now my dream has in a way come true. In April, the number of air travelers in Sweden decreased by 98%, and globally aviation may be reduced by as much as 2/3 in 2020. But unfortunately, this has happened for the wrong reason. The pandemic really isn't something to be happy about, and a temporary flight stop won't solve the climate crisis either. But the pandemic has shown that a rapid change is possible, and that so many people have been forced to cancel their flights hasn't led to any major protests. There's simply been no other choice to limit the spread of the coronavirus. And if we are to succeed in solving the climate crisis, there is no choice either. We have to do everything in our power to cut our emissions, and yet so many of us continue to fly on holiday. why is that? That's a question that I've asked myself so many times, but I rarely dared to ask others the same question. For many years, I used to remain silent when people talked about their flights, as I didn't want to be a killjoy. But 2 years ago, I felt that it just didn't make sense to be more scared of destroying the mood than a climate collapse. So I gave myself a New Year's resolution to start asking people questions when they told me about their flights. And I soon realized that most people hadn't even reflected about this, and also that it was possible to talk about it. And around the same time, the flying debate intensified here in Sweden, and I just felt that, oh, finally. And I had had this thought of starting a campaign for quite a few years, and I felt that if I'm ever going to do it, the time is now. So together with my neighbor, Lotta Hammar, we started the campaign Flight Free 2019, with the goal of convincing 100,000 Swedes to take a flight-free year. And this was just supposed to be a project in my spare time, but for the past 2 years, I've been working with building the organization We Stay on the Ground, or Vi håller oss på jorden, full time. And the campaign Flight Free 2019 has also become Flight Free 2020 and has spread to other countries as well. And working with this has been a real eye-opener to me. I used to think that people made a conscious choice to fly despite the climate crisis, but I realized that most people aren't aware of the severity of the situation and also don't know how damaging flying is for the climate. And even though people have become more aware during the past couple of years, there is still a lot of confusion about the climate impact from flying. And no wonder that there are so many misconceptions, because we received so many double messages about this. In the papers, news about the climate impact from flying sits next to articles about cheap holiday flights. And also, when we see that everyone else around us continues to fly, it's easy to believe that it really can't be that bad, and think that we should deal with all the things that are worse instead. That's really the most common counter argument that I meet when we're out talking to people about this, that shouldn't we deal with what's worse? And the media, they are experts in confirming this. I don't know how many times I've seen headlines saying that this and that is worse than flying. And this is problematic, as it makes people think that it's enough to deal with what's worst, just one thing, and it's also incorrect. Most people aren't aware that the reason emissions from aviation aren't higher is because very few people in the world are flying. And for people who fly, air travel is often the single largest source of emissions, and just one annual holiday flight can use up your entire annual carbon budget. And another very common view, and especially I would say among people who are aware of the climate issue, is that it doesn't matter what we do as individuals, or that we can't put the responsibility on the individuals, and that we need political solutions if we are to succeed in solving the climate crisis. And that is of course true. But if we are to succeed in changing the system, more people need to wake up and realize the severity of the situation, and also what needs to be done to solve the climate crisis. Because if you're not aware of this, you won't demand any political solutions. So how do we make people realize this? Information isn't enough. We can't just talk about what needs to be done. I think it's problematic that many climate experts and politicians, they continue to fly. And even though their flights may be important and contribute to reducing the emissions in the long run, most people don't think this way, and instead we get the impression that we can keep living as usual. And that Greta Thunberg has managed to get so many people aware of the climate crisis is not just because she's extremely knowledgeable and a great speaker, it's also that she's showing with her actions what needs to be done. So to me, working with this campaign has made me realize just how much we are affected of what other people do. When we first launched the campaign 2 years ago, the strategy was to share news about how bad flying is for the climate, and that really didn't inspire many people to make pledge for a flight-free year. And it was not until I started to go out campaigning in reality and taking pictures of people together with our flyer, who made the pledge, and that we shared on social media. And I was also writing interviews with people who had decided to take a flight for a year, where they explained why they did that, or they maybe shared a story of how much they enjoy traveling without flying, for example. And when we started doing that, that's when the campaign started growing. So we really listen much more to people around us, and especially to what they do, than we listen to facts. And I have a really good example. Once in the beginning of this, I was talking to two men in their 60s who looked like they had quite a lot of money, and they were talking to me saying that, oh, we go abroad all the time. We fly and we play golf abroad together. And at first, they didn't really want to take in what I was saying, but we ended up having a good conversation. And after a while, I asked one of them, and I said, so what if your friend here were saying the exact same things as I do? How would you react then? And he was like, well, I guess if he said so, and if he didn't want to fly, I would probably be okay with not doing that either. And I've been using this argument quite a lot. And when I meet people who say that they would never be willing to sacrifice their flights, I ask them, what would you do if everyone around you decided to give up flying until we solved the climate crisis? And quite a lot of people actually then admit and say that, well, yeah, in that case, I suppose I would be prepared to do so. There is a concern about encouraging people to make individual changes, and it's that it can be a risk that people think that making individual changes is enough, and that they then won't sort of make political demands. But I believe that there's rather a risk that people distance themselves from this issue if we say then to tell them that they can't make a difference. I think it's easy to feel that, okay, well, let's not bother them, someone else will have to solve this, or that it's enough to vote, for example. From what I've seen, once people make the pledge to take a flight for a year, they want everyone else to do the same. I've convinced several people that I know, like friends and relatives, who's really been hesitating at first, saying, oh, I'm not prepared to do that, and then they agree to do it. And once they made the decision, they are like, okay, give me some flyers and I will bring them to work and ask all my colleagues to do the same. Because you want others to follow if you are making this sacrifice. And I think you're more likely to make political demands if you realize that we can't keep flying and you decide to do that yourself. So to stop flying can be like a gateway to become active in other ways. Another criticism is that guilt and shame can be counterproductive. And I agree. I'm not a fan of the term flight shame. That's really not what we're trying to do, to make people feel ashamed. To me, campaigning for people to stay on the ground, it's about showing that everyone is important and can make a difference. And it's a way to make people feel involved in the climate issue. So giving up flying, it's not about shame. It's rather something that can be empowering and something to be proud of. And something that struck me when our Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, held his speech to the nation about the pandemic was that he really emphasized the importance of solidarity and that we can all make a difference. And I wish that we could talk about the climate crisis in the same way. So to give up flying is a very effective way to reduce emissions in itself, but the biggest effect from this lies in that it contributes to changing the norm, if we also talk about it, of course. And that we Swedes are flying less has spread all over the world, and the flying debate, it's contributed to that the flying debate has started in many other countries as well. And even though we weren't even close to reaching the goal of 100,000 pledges in our campaign, media from around 20 countries all over the world have written about the campaign, which has also made it spread to other countries as well. And as you all probably know, then a dedicated minority can change the attitudes of the majority. And by doing this together, we can take collective responsibility and lay the foundation for the political decisions that we so desperately need. And the development here in Sweden during the past few years has shown that a change can happen really fast. Last year, air travel in Sweden decreased by 4% and domestically by a full 9%. And in January 2020, the decrease was 8% compared to January in 2018, which is when the flying debate intensified here. And according to an investigation by the WWF, 23% of Swedes said that they had chosen trains before planes last year. So the norm has started to shift, and it has affected people all over the world. According to another survey by the European Investment Bank, 75% of Europeans, 69% of Americans, and a full 94% of Chinese people claim that they intended to fly less during 2020. And the head of the International Air Transport Association has even described flight shame as one of the biggest threats to the airline industry. But this was, of course, before the pandemic broke out. So the question is, what will happen now? Will we go back to normal after this? Will people even fly more to compensate for the lost flights? Or will the pandemic strengthen the trend to stay on the ground and fundamentally change the way that we travel? Perhaps the pandemic will make us realize that our society is vulnerable and make us more receptive for the climate crisis. And perhaps it will also make us realize what really matters in life. It's hardly the cancelled holiday flights that people are suffering the most from right now. It's rather the lack of social contacts, which is something that we definitely don't need to sacrifice in order to solve the climate crisis. So this really would be a great opportunity for our politicians to communicate that the climate crisis also really is a crisis and to make the decisions needed. But during the pandemic, we've been encouraged not to travel if it can be avoided. And the same should really apply for the climate, at least when it comes to flying. Because even though there are many flights that can't be avoided, nobody really has to fly on holiday in an acute crisis. But unfortunately, that's not really the impression you get when the flying industry is now promised billions in bailouts, mostly without any counterclaims to reduce emissions. I think it's just Germany and France who have these. But despite the bailouts, the flying industry is in a deep crisis. And many low-cost airlines will be bankrupt, and ticket prices are predicted to be much higher in the future. And even if the number of flights have started to increase again, it's still not clear when it will be possible to travel as before. And even when we will be allowed to do so, to travel without restrictions, people may still be more careful than before as well. Also, the pandemic may speed up the growing trend of staycations. Perhaps more of us will realize that there are so many places to explore closer to home. And the pandemic has also increased our acceptance for digital meetings. I read somewhere that Zoom, for example, had increased the amount of users from 10 million in the beginning of 2020 to 200 million now. So hopefully this has made people realize that it's possible to connect with people from all over the world without necessarily meeting them in person, and that digital meetings can save both time and money as well as emissions. And these are, of course, my speculations. And I'm sure that Stefan and Jörgen will have more to say about this in a minute. Something that I think will be of great importance is how the flying debate will be framed in the future. Lately, I've read several texts about the fact that emissions will only be reduced by around 5 to 7% this year. And it's such a shame, I think, that it's framed that way, as there is a risk that people don't think that changed travel habits can make a difference. And I really don't think that this is that little, because apart from us traveling less by air and by car, there hasn't been any huge changes in our society. And if people had stopped flying for climate reasons instead, that would also be a very clear indicator of increased climate awareness and lead to so many other changes as well. So I think 5% is still important. And for the people who fly, the reductions are, of course, much bigger than that. And again, it's not enough to just choose one thing. We need to do everything. To reduce the spread of the coronavirus, it's, for example, we can't just only wash our hands. We also need to keep a social distance and avoid traveling. And above all, we all need also to contribute, just like the Prime Minister said in his speech about the pandemic. A big difference between how the corona crisis and the climate crisis is communicated is that it's been made clear that the pandemic really is an urgent crisis. So a very important challenge is to make more people realize that the climate crisis is just as urgent, and especially what needs to be done about it. So we who have understood this have an important task in communicating this in a comprehensive way, which reaches out to people. And this is something that we will put a lot of focus on in the future. One problem with climate communication is that we tend to reach those who are already aware of this issue. And we would like to take advantage of that instead. And we launch a campaign which is directed to all the people who are aware of that we can't continue to fly the way we do today, and encourage them to talk about the climate crisis and the role of aviation with all of those who haven't thought about this yet. So we are now planning to launch an ongoing campaign building on the guide. We need to talk about aviation that I've written. And in this guide, I give advice about how we can talk about this, but also I respond to the 26 most common counter arguments that I usually meet when I'm out talking about giving up. And because many people find it very difficult still to talk about this, even the people who has decided to give up flying themselves or to fly less, they think it's really hard to start asking people about this, just like I did. And for me, it was a big relief to be able to sort of lean on this promise. I used to start the conversation saying that this is making me feel really uncomfortable, but I've promised myself to ask everyone. So now I will ask you, aren't you concerned about the climate crisis? And I think if we make a campaign like this, people can say that they have joined a campaign in which everyone has promised to do this. So people won't feel like they are the only ones being asked. So what we're trying to do is really to normalize climate conversations. Because when it comes to the corona pandemic, it's something that we all talk about in our everyday life. Like, I live on an island outside of Gothenburg, and if I just go to the local food shop, there's always somebody talking about it. And I wish we could do the same about the climate crisis, because I think that would make it more real to people. And I think for those of us who are aware of the climate issue and have been for many years, it's quite difficult sometimes to imagine that there still are so many people out there who haven't really thought about this. But that's really one of the most important things I've learned from my work. I've met people, and people have been contacting me saying that your campaign made me wake up and realize that, oh, we can't keep living the way we do. And they decided to make the pledge, and now they also want to become engaged or go out campaigning themselves. So I think there is a lot of potential out there that we really should take care of. And many people are in their everyday lives so concerned that they do everything in their power to reduce their own emissions. But if they instead start talking to people about this and make these kind of changes as well, you can really get much more for your effort. And it's also something that I would really recommend everyone to try talking about. It gives so much energy. I can't wait for the pandemic to be over so I can go out and talk to people again about this, because it's such a good feeling when you notice that you're actually making somebody think and that we're affecting them. And of course, we won't be able to reach out to everyone. But as I said before, a small minority can really make big changes. And we had also been planning to start, before the pandemic broke out, we had been planning to start a new global flight-free campaign, which would look slightly different than the ones we had before. But we felt that it's not really the right time now, and we want to wait a little bit to see what will happen. So I'm really curious to hear what Jörgen and Stefan will have to say about this as well. So to summarize, to make people give up flying is not the solution to the climate crisis, but it is an important and necessary part of the solution. Because not only is it a very effective way to quickly reduce our emissions, it's also a really powerful tool to get more people to wake up and realize that the climate crisis really is a crisis, which is crucial if we are to succeed in getting the political changes that are necessary. So I believe that what the world really needs now is to replace the corona pandemic with a climate insight pandemic. And this is something that we all can help spread by staying on the ground even after the pandemic has passed. Thank you so much. That's what I have to say.
Thanks so much, Maya, for a really inspiring presentation. I think in the interest of time, I'd like to turn over quite quickly to both Stefan and Jürgen so that we can start unfolding and unpacking some of the things that you've mentioned already. We have a total of around 15 minutes for this next section. Jürgen and Stefan, feel free to divide that between yourselves. I think we had thought around 5 minutes for each of you, and then 5 minutes for kind of a more open conversation if you'd like to bounce anything back off Maya, for example. And I would suggest that, Stefan, if you would like to start.
Sure. Well, thanks, Maya. Very enlightening thoughts, obviously, and very important thoughts. And as you say, a lot can change because of individuals. The changes that we have seen because of Greta and your work, of course, are pretty fundamental because it's a big thing to change society. And it never goes quick most of the time. But I wanted to talk very quickly about some of the key insights that perhaps my personal research has contributed over the last 2-3 years. First of all, when we talk about flying, it's very often presented as a very fundamental need, right? Something that we really have to give up, and that is some form of punishment if we can't fly. But if you look into the studies that we've done, then it's quite interesting to see that, first of all, how much we fly is very much a function of the income that we have, how much money we can spend, and obviously in reverse, the cost of flying. So if you don't have low-cost flights, people probably don't expect to fly low cost, you know, they will just not fly. It's as simple as that. We also asked an international group of students to rank their flights if they were all equally important. And then surprisingly, an almost 7.5 share was ranked 5, not important at all. So flyers themselves will tell you that a lot of their flight activity is not really needed. And I think that gives us a pretty different starting point for discussing whether we can and should fly less and what the implications might be. Also, in terms of distribution, we have another paper just finished that I thought I should bring in here. Globally, we calculated only 11% of the world population fly in a year. But if you look at international flights crossing a border, then it boils down to just 4%. So only 4% of the world population will ever fly in a given year over a border. And much of the air travel that does take place is actually taking place in the US and by very selected individual. We did a calculation for one of the worst, if you want, a Russian oligarch whose name I obviously cannot mention, but he owns a football league, so you might recognize who I'm talking about. And if you look into the flight patterns and the consumption that these super emitters bring together, it's probably 150,000 times what a person in Central Africa will emit over a year. So there's this issue of distribution that we need to push more, I think, because the industry is very frequently trying to tell us all, oh, everybody's flying, you know, it's the most normal thing in the world, and it's not. That then also brings me to the question of risks that we have to discuss. I think it's quite interesting how we're now pushing the billions at the flight industry again, even though nobody even acknowledges that, you know, it was aviation that brought corona all over the world within a month. So there's risk associated with flying that imply cost. That cost is massive. And I think since our lives are structured by cost-benefit analysis, it would be very fair to also include that cost into the cost of flying. And then finally, I think to me, the big challenge is now the question of how, which kind of policies, apart from the social change, will bring us on track. And the interesting thing is that in most countries, you have a very large majority of people supporting policies that would make flying more difficult for all of us. So this is a classical consumer-citizen gap, as we call it, where people are not willing to change behavior themselves, but they are very willing to vote for policies that would make everybody change behavior. And I think that's a very good avenue. And I think Jürgen's most recent research has actually, you know, triggered some thoughts in that direction for me, because you found, Jürgen, that there's a small group, like 30% of the population, that is really opposed to all the measures that would make the sector change. And obviously, that's the very frequent flyers, or those people that for one reason or another don't want to give up flying. So the broad majority regularly supports policies that, that would make all of us change. So I think there's hope here. We have opportunities because the population really knows what the problem is, I think. And most of them also want to support change in the sense that they either make personal changes to their lifestyles, or that they support policies, and policymakers have to react to that. And if you bring both together, I think we can positively reinforce the social norm change that is behind everything, and that we need to continue to push. Because honestly, I've been working with climate change in aviation for 25 years, and up to Greta Thunberg, nobody ever thought that was of any importance. So it's a very good point in time, I think, to continue working with this.
Thanks so much, Stefan. Over to you, Jürgen.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting to listen to you both, and I agree very much that activism is fundamental for achieving normative change, discursive change. That's not, however, not my focus. I will share some slides and describe what I do currently. Is it viewed now?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So as Stefan said, I have this paper just came out a couple of weeks ago about public support for aviation policy measures in Sweden. So it's open access. You can, if you want to look at it. But today I'll talk mainly briefly on two pieces of ongoing work. One on the future technical potential of long distance travel, and then potential through other transport modes and transport choices. So I'll run through this quickly, I hope. Let me see how I do that. There. So this work I do with Jonas Åkerman and a few others. We looked at the technological potential, and just very, very fast, I will describe this. First, about the air travel. Most of our emissions, they come from long distance intercontinental travel. We usually tend to forget this, but over 60% is for these very long trips, which are hard to imagine that they can be done through train or boat or so, to the extent that they are now. So this is a major problem. This means also that like high-speed rail and other forms of investments are not really influencing most of the air travel emissions, since they are mainly for the 10% of the shortest distances. When it comes to it nowadays, you have written before Stefan, about myths of how we could solve this. The current big myth, or the current, maybe not a myth, but the current hype is about all electric aircrafts. And the problem is the energy density. It's even if you include that the energy engines are more efficient, it's still 30 times heavier than jet fuel. And just the batteries are just as heavy when you land as when you take off. This is a major problem. And British researcher made a scenario for 2050, and in that scenario, the batteries were 4 times lighter per energy unit. And then they think that you can cover distances up to 1,100 kilometers, and that would be then about 10 to 15% of the current air travel among Swedes. So the all-electric aircrafts would not do the job for us, at least not according to this scenario for 2050, maybe even further in the future, or faster if we have battery inventions that would wipe out the field totally, but we cannot count on such inventions. Hydrogen aircraft is another hope that has a better potential, I think, but they require completely new aircraft designs and infrastructure. So here on this very bad image, it's you have an extra body above the traditional aircraft body, where you have this large room for this liquefied hydrogen. But the engines, current engines can be modified, so it's not a completely new engine development, but it's a completely new production and distribution of the fuel. But it can be renewable, made from solar and wind, and it requires energy intensive liquefaction. And then this would solve most of the carbon problem, and then you have the non-carbon effects or the high altitude effects. And in order to avoid those, you would need to fly at least partly on lower altitudes. But it could be a potential. Then avoiding contrails or the aircraft-induced cirrus clouds, it has a good potential. If we, according to this study, if we would change the flying patterns for 2% of the flights, then 80% of these high altitude effects could be avoided. That would mean that we would fly lower or sideways to avoid these areas where these problems occur. And then we could say about this for transport within Europe, we have overlapping options like high-speed rail, night trains, all electric aircrafts, and also slower aircraft which are more energy efficient. But they are possible for these fairly short distances, but not covering most of the current emissions. For intercontinental trips, we need to reduce travel volumes, at least for the coming decades. And then finally, hydrogen, electric aircraft, and high-speed rail, they take decades to develop and implement. So this is not what we need for the coming 20 or 30 years when we really need to reduce global emissions. So it supports your argument, Stefan, that we cannot continue as usual and hoping for technology to fix this for us. We need to reduce travel volumes. And just 2 minutes on another study where we focus on this. What type of trips do we do first, and why do we do them? And flying away to find warm climate is the most common activity. Visiting friends and family is the second most common one, and that's hard to change. by taking by virtual meetings or so, or taking another destination. But then business is 18% of air travel emissions. Very briefly about, we have here examined alternative trips with similar activity, but so it's not about avoiding or skipping vacationing or business trips. It's about doing it in a different way. And we estimated the potential from other modes of transport first, and we found that if all trips within Europe would be conducted by rail or train instead of air travel, then the total emissions from Swedish air travel would be reduced by 26%. And then if people who that now, for example, go to Florida for getting warm weather, if they would, if all those would choose closer destination that can offer the same activity, then 21% would be reduced. And if all types of business trips where you can think about doing it on a virtual meeting instead, then 12% could be avoided. Just very briefly, these studies are not yet published, they're under review. The theoretical potential here is then 67%. We also ask people about their readiness to do these changes, and then the potential is much lower. According to their statements, the potential then is 26%. Finally, I want to advertise for the email list called Flyg och Klimat. It's for people that are interested in this in their jobs. So if you want to join the list, just send me an email and I'll send you the link. Thank you. I think that was 5 minutes or maybe more. I cannot hear anything.
Yes.
There. Oh, there. Great.
Thank you, Jörgen. See if will you quit your screen sharing?
Yes.
There. Perfect. Yes. Thanks so much both Jörgen and Stefan and Maja for these interesting presentations. We've got a few questions coming through, and the first one is from Paul Puley. You want to turn your video on and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks so much. Really interesting to hear from you all. It's so helpful. Excuse me. The dilemma that I've been sitting with is I've been in Sweden, living in Sweden now for about a year and a half. And obviously working on climate issues myself, I'm very sympathetic to a flight-free life. And I guess the question that I want to pose, and it's not to anyone in particular, it's whoever wants to respond, is as an international person here in Sweden, I've got friends and family, dear friends and family from my previous life in Australia and the United States. And the question that it's raised for me as I've gotten further into this notion of being flight free is how do I reconcile that with the people that I'm deal with, that I'm close with, because it really requires for me to then potentially not see friends and family if I stopped flying entirely. And the way that I've dealt with that is budgeting myself with one trip where I'm away from my life here for longer and packing a bunch of visits in. But because I've got life on the other side of the planet, it means it's still a big flight. So I'm just curious, how would you, like, I'm troubling it in myself, and how would you respond to that with the things that you've raised, or any or all of you?
I think Maja would be she has thought about this answer for years now. I want to hear her answer.
I can answer that. It really is the most difficult question that we get. I think it's so difficult to respond so, and I'm very grateful that I'm not in that position myself. So I think in a way, you can say that the climate doesn't care about family relations. There is no room for emissions. But also, I do understand that people want to see their family. So I think, of course, what you're doing is trying to avoid doing it as often as possible. I think, for example, if you have 5 people living in one continent and 1 people living on the other, it makes more sense that the one person goes and visits the others than the other way. I think it's something that you can do, which is really important, is to talk about this with others and say that you really think this is a concern and that you wish you didn't have to fly, because then you will also at least make people aware that you don't want to contribute to the flight norm if you could avoid it. So I think it's super difficult. I think what we're trying to focus on is that here and now, that if we do everything to cut our emissions now as soon as possible, the better the possibilities will be to travel in the future. So the more we can avoid traveling in the nearest future, the better. I think we're at the point where we really need to get started to like make the emission curve go down. So I don't think I have a better answer than that.
Great. Stefan or Jürgen, anyone want to add any reflections on it? Otherwise, we've got another question for Maya regarding from Chuck, who says that some of the activist organizations in France have tried to make the argument that short-term flights, domestic flights, should simply be forbidden. And he was wondering if that is part of your movement, or if not, why you don't make that argument?
Up until now, we haven't really made any political demands that way, but I think we definitely want that and more. I mean, to me, it doesn't make sense that we can go on holidays when we don't have to. So I think the only reason that we really haven't focused, or there are actually some reasons for this. One is that we really want to focus on the individuals, because in a way it can be, if people think that they can just sign a petition, they are sort of let off the hook and they don't have to make individual changes. But I would like to run another campaign, a more political one as well. And the reason we haven't done that so far is because we don't have enough resources. But we're actually having a meeting tomorrow at 10 discussing the future for this. So we'll see what happens.
Thanks. And yeah, for the panelists, Jürgen and Stefan, just raise your hand if you want to add anything in any of these comments. Otherwise, Masha is next to ask your question.
Yeah. Thank you all for the contributions. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. I have a question to all 3 of you that I think might be a bit provocative. Maya, one of the first things you said is that people listen more to people around them than to facts when it comes to transitioning to not flying. So what do you think could be, or maybe should be, the role of academia? Because traditionally our role is to produce the facts.
Yeah, as I said a little bit in my speech, I think it's super important that people in the academia really lead by example. I think it's a problem. I've met so many people who say that, for example, you know, as long as the climate researchers keep flying, it can't be a problem. And I will change when they change, or I will stop flying when Isabella Löfven stops flying. So I really think that even if I do understand that in a way your work is really important and can contribute to reduced emissions, that's not how it's perceived by people. So I think the more you can follow Greta Thunberg's example, the better. For example, Kevin Anderson, I think he's made a lot of people aware of this issue. So, yeah.
What do the panelists think about it?
I could comment a bit. Well, I think of course scientists have a normative role in society, but I would not want climate researchers to stop flying, even if it has some normative negative changes. So but they need to speak to each other, and they need to speak to policymakers. But of course we need to reduce our emission, our flying, and we can do that. I think I have been flying three times during the last 15 years in my career as a researcher, and I have not been totally unsuccessful. So it's possible, but I think our role is to give facts, as you say, but it's not only like facts about how the climate works and so on. I think more relevant knowledge for policy making and for understanding individual change and normative changes and stuff like that is very important, and to interact and share this knowledge with activists and policymakers are other important roles.
Great, thank you. Next up, we got a comment from Michal. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Yes, and it's interesting in your research, Jörgen, that this visiting family and friends is such a common category. And I was wondering if you have them, if they are allowed to overlap with other categories, because in our interviews we see that people tend to use having a family member or a friend somewhere, or like acquaintance somewhere in the world as an excuse, as an opportunity to travel. You know, like I go there because my friend lives there, and you know, it's not necessarily like, it's not like visiting your mother once a year or like going to a wedding. It's more like, oh, she lives in Paris, so I just go to Paris because, you know, it's just like an additional thing. So yeah, just a comment and maybe question how to, you know, take it into account in the campaigns and research and so on.
Yes, yes, I agree. It's overlapping, so they could give us several responses for the. For example, getting warm climate and visiting family and friends, they could give both of those. So and some people might even misinterpret this question and thinking that it's to be with your traveling companions that we're asking about, even if we state that it's to visit the family and friends. They might interpret it as to be with family and friends, because usually you travel with family and friends. So surely it's not 26% that is to see your old mother once a year or so, but it's people born in other countries, but living in Sweden, they travel quite a lot, even if they have much lower incomes. They travel more than average. So these trips are probably often to their previous country. So it's a part there, but it's not as big as 26% in a crucial way, I would say.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. We got a comment from Daniel next up, Daniel Pagman.
Yeah, I actually commented in the chat and was asked to comment here. So we have a research project at KTH where we look at our own travel. Our chancellor or president has actually stated that we will decrease our carbon emissions from flying with 6% in the next decade. I'm not sure she realizes what the effects would be of that, because that means we will, well, slash our flying, especially long-distance flying, if we're going to attain that goal. So we just started that project a year ago, and we have really interesting results. We have like all the data for all researchers, all travel in the last 3 years. And we go along, we collect the 4th year and for the 5th and so on. Well, just to mention, we've said that in the chat, but travel is really unequally distributed. Also, for example, within KTH, top 20% of flyers are responsible for 60% of the emissions, and top 5% are responsible for more than a quarter of the total emissions from our university, and that's 81 persons. So I've jokingly said that the easiest way to cut our emissions would be to fire those people. I don't think that's an option, because they are also, there's a correlation. They are the best paid and most senior, or some of the best paid and most senior researchers, of course. But anyway, it's really exciting to dig into this data and see if we can help our one university. This is also an answer to the previous question, to decrease our emissions. But it's a long way. I mean, just as Maya said, many people are not really aware or conscious or care, and there are 1,001 explanations of why my trips are really, really important. Also, we pledged, by the way, when we applied for money, not to use any of the money we got for the research project to fly. So we have pledged not to disseminate our results by means of flying, but rather video conference, train travel, or journal articles, just to see if it's possible.
Great, thank you. Would you perhaps want to comment on that, Stefan, and the carbon inequality and how we can maybe address the high emitters or the super emitters?
Yeah, I think I've outlined earlier that there is this huge discrepancy between the small minorities that fly a lot and cause quite substantial emissions, and then all the rest of the population. For instance, in the United States, you have 12% of the population taking 68% of the flights. And we also estimate in our most recent paper that there's a secondary issue connected that we haven't discussed so far. But if you take an A380 airliner, for instance, then the upper deck, consisting just of premier class seats, is probably using as much in emissions as the lower deck. But on the lower deck, you have 60%, or no, 85% of the seats, and just 15% in the first class, and then another, I think, what's that, 25 in business class. So if you take that into consideration, then probably we estimate that there's a 10 to 55 correlation in terms of energy use in emissions. So 10% of the travelers in the world are responsible for about 55% of the emissions. And mind you, not just a share of that is covered by climate policies even, because we talk all the time about CORSIA and what the airline industry is doing at the moment in order to tackle emissions, or rather not, because in the next days they will decide to take 2019 as the base year. So in other words, until they actually get there where they have to reduce emissions or offset emissions is a long-term future thing. But most emissions are not covered by climate policy, because essentially half the climate effect from flying is non-CO2 emissions, which are not covered anywhere. Then we probably have an 8% share of all emissions globally from aviation that are military, not covered anywhere either. And finally, you have 4% business flights that are not covered. 18% of all emissions from aviation, CO2, is just US domestic. You know that US doesn't take responsibility for emissions. So we need to dig deeper into these correlations, and then build climate policies on that basis. And these policies probably will have to be national, because ICAO is not a player that we can trust to resolve this.
Great, Stefan. We're running out of time here. I'll soon let Jörgen in. I guess that we've had quite a lot of requests for references to articles and numbers and stuff. We'll try to collect them and put them on our website afterwards for anyone who's interested. And hopefully you, Stefan and Jörgen, can share them with us as well. So Jörgen, do you want to have a last brief response?
Yes, briefly about this inequality of flying, and then you could say that the policies should address this inequality, you could argue. especially since the whether policies are viewed as fair, it's very much influencing whether people will accept them or not. And we have analyzed a couple of policies that addresses this inequality, and one is the frequent flyer tax. It could be played out as you would have a high fly passenger tax, perhaps 10 times higher than the one we have today, but then you would be allowed to make a tax reduction on your yearly tax declaration for parts of it. So this would only be paid fully by frequent flyers. And you could even also think about individual carbon budgets for air travel alone, since it's much easier to implement there than for meat consumption, for example. Air tickets are registered already, so you could link that to an individual account, and if you exceed a set level, then you would have to purchase emission carbon space from someone else, which would be very expensive, and it would also transfer cash from low income earners to high income frequent flyers. But these types of policy instruments, they are not in line with our existing liberal view of how we should run society, but there are options if we wanted to take the climate issue serious in the future.
Great, thank you all. Thank you, Jürgen, Stefan, and Maya for super interesting presentations and comments. Everyone clap their hands as we do online. And thank you all for joining us. And we'll try to share references on our website for those who are interested in that. And please look out for our next transition talk that will be in September with Sanna Vanna about climate justice and Samiora and Sapmi issues related to Sapmi and infrastructure. We don't know yet if it will be online or on campus at Chalmers. No one really knows, but we'll get back to you as soon as we can with that. Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining.